A video series about why I gave up on intermittent fasting and went back to essentially just a regular caloric restriction with optimal nutrition diet. Although it's vegan, it is technically just a regular calorie restriction with optimal nutrition plus the veganism. But I mean, for the most part, a Cron diet is pretty much vegan anyway. For the most part, it's just because it's the easiest way to cut out the calories and increase the nutrient density of the diet. So association of skipping breakfast with cardiovascular and all-cause mortality. Now, what led me back to this, just going back to a regular Cron diet? It was actually Greg Doucette who kept explaining the dangers of fasted cardio, the dangers of intermittent fasting, and the need to fuel your body for exercise. One of the things I noticed is intermittent fasting had me feeling like crap a lot, okay? And, you know, when I'm not intermittently fasting, I don't feel as much like crap when I'm just practicing a regularly calorically restricted diet, when I'm getting between 1,500 and 2,300 calories per day, depending on the day, I feel much better. So what I do is I get about 1,500 calories most days of the week and 2,300 calories 1 or 2 days of the week. So the background, skipping breakfast is common among U.S. adults. Okay, results, okay, blah, blah, blah. Okay, conclusion. In a national representative cohort with 17 to 23 years of follow-up, skipping breakfast was associated with a significantly increased risk of mortality from cardiovascular disease. Their study supports the benefits of eating breakfast and promoting cardiovascular health. Now, one of the things that I will say is Dr. Sean Baker actually did a video about this, and what his point was, and it was actually a pretty decent point, some of this research, when they do research like this, it did seem like maybe some of the research that's done like this, some of the folks just were poor and in a sense were not eating a very nourishing diet in general. But what I want to point out, though, is there are, of course, dangers in not fueling your body correctly. Lou Ferrigno did a video a while back stating that you needed to eat a balanced diet. One of the problems with when he was in bodybuilding, they ate a high-fat, high-protein diet, which did leave you leaner, but it also left you feeling very dehydrated. And I'm going to move on to the next thing now. The association of skipping breakfast with cancer-related and all-cause mortality in a national cohort of the United States adults. Okay. So the conclusion with this study is, in this nationally representative sample, skipping breakfast was associated with elevated risks of all-cause and cancer-related mortality. The study provides evidence for the benefits of regular breakfast consumption in reducing the risk of all-cause and cancer-related mortality. Meal skipping and shorter meal intervals are associated with increased risk of all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so this is about its association with cardiovascular disease. Okay, in this large prospective study of U.S. adults aged 40 years or older, eating one meal per day was associated with an increased risk of all-cause and cardiovascular disease mortality. Skipping breakfast was associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease, whereas skipping lunch or dinner was associated with increased risk of all-cause mortality. So skipping breakfast increased your risk of cardiovascular disease, whereas skipping lunch or dinner seems to have increased your risk of all-cause mortality. Among participants with 3 meals per day, a meal interval of 4.5 hours and 2 adjacent meals was associated with higher all-cause mortality. Okay. So this is showing literally that intermittent fasting is most likely associated with an increased risk of all-cause mortality. Association between breakfast composition and abdominal obesity. So the reason I titled this video that skipping breakfast or that eating breakfast isn't bad for you necessarily is because it does depend on what your breakfast consists of. The quality of the diet is also very important. So, regular breakfast, okay, so conclusion. Regular breakfast consumers had less abdominal obesity if their breakfast was composed of fruit, natural cereal flakes like bran, nuts, seeds, and yogurt. This association was partly explained by their healthier diet during the rest of the day. So keep that in mind. It does depend on what you're eating. The quality of your diet depends a great deal on how much health your diet is going to promote. But the answer is not skipping meals. The answer is changing the composition of your diet to a healthier composition. So keep that in mind. Regular breakfast consumers had less abdominal fat, less visceral fat, if their breakfast was composed of fruit, natural cereal flakes, nuts, seeds, and yogurt. Okay? So when you're eating a healthier diet, a higher quality diet, it's going to promote health. But the answer to losing visceral fat is to control your calorie consumption and to eat much less, to eat a higher quality diet, not to skip meals and not to do things like that. Not to, we've known this for years, actually. I'm actually somewhat ashamed of myself that I bought into the intermittent fasting bandwagon. So here we're going to look at how abdominal fat, what should you make your diet out of? Well, whole grains are vilified these days, but central obesity is associated with a lower intake of whole grain bread and less frequent breakfast and lunch consumption. Okay, so let's take a look at this. So all population and area-based investigations of diet in central obesity, meaning the visceral fat, the fat around the abdominal region, they used a cross-sectional data, blah, 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 obesity, eat and drink. Answers to dietary questions were recoded and analyzed with multiple linear regression using waist-to-hip ratio, age, and sex as explanatory variables. Okay, frequencies of consumption or amount of food, beverages, and meals were compared. Okay. Dietary variables differed markedly by age, sex, blah, blah, blah. After adjustment, central obesity was associated with a lower intake of any bread and of whole grain bread in particular. So a lower intake of whole grain bread in particular related to a higher central obesity. Intake of fruits and berries, vegetables, and pasta and rice was less, and intake of sausages and hamburgers and boiled potatoes was more frequent. So the more, obviously, the more sausages and hamburgers and boiled potatoes you eat, the more central obesity you're going to have. Intake of alcohol, tea, and fruit juice was lower in those with central obesity, whereas intake of sugar-free soft drinks and coffee was higher. And again, this is because a lot of people that are drinking sugar-free soft drinks and coffee are doing so to make up for their waning energy a lot of times. Okay? So you do have to look at the reasons why people are doing this. And that's one of the things that they don't look for in these studies is the why. But if you work with enough fat people like I have, you start to understand the reasons why when you ask them the why. Okay, so we're going to move on. So this study is about food selection associated with sense of coherence in adults. Favorable dietary habits promote health. Okay, we know this from the Blue Zones research and the Adventist research and virtually any research that has to do with diet, whether it's the Atkins diet, the Mediterranean diet, etc. But we know that favorable dietary habits promote health, whereas unfavorable dietary habits obviously cause various chronic diseases. An individual's sense of coherence is reported to correlate with prevalence of some diseases in which dietary habits are linked. However, understanding what determines an individual's dietary preference and how to change his or her behaviors remains limited. The aim of the present study was to evaluate associations between dietary intake and sense of coherence. Diet intake was recorded by an 84-item semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire. Sense of coherence was measured by the 13-item questionnaire in 2,446 men and 2,545 women, ages 25 to 74 years old, from the population based in northern Sweden. Okay. Results. Intakes of energy, total, and saturated fat, ascorbic acid, sucrose, and servings of fruits, vegetables, cereals, and sweets correlated with sense of coherence among women, whereas intakes of total and saturated fat, ascorbic acid, fiber, and alcohol, and servings of fruits, vegetables, bread, and cereals, first, and potatoes correlated with sense of coherence among men, with a few exceptions. Intakes of these nutrients/foods were significantly explained by the sense of coherence quartile scores in linear GLM model. Both women and men classified into the highest sense of coherence quartile had significantly higher age, body mass index, education, standardized mean intakes of vegetables than those in the lowest quartiles. Women in the highest sense of coherence quartile also had higher intake of fruits and vegetables, but lower intakes of energy. So the women had lower overall intakes of calories, which is what they're calling energy, of course, because that's what calorie is. It's a measure of energy. But they also consumed far more fruits and vegetables. Projection of latent structures, blah, blah, blah. Conclusion, both men and women in the highest as compared to the lowest sense of coherence score quartile reported more healthy food choices, dietary habits for individuals in the lowest sense of coherence quartile, therefore may render a higher risk for various endemic diseases. So I received education in health class about what to eat back when I was in elementary school. Now, this is a study from China, effective school-based nutrition and health education for rural Chinese children. Now, what you will find is this resulted in the students making better, healthier food choices. So the nutritional status of rural Chinese children has improved in recent years, but their nutritional knowledge is still relatively lacking. School-based nutrition and health education was conducted for children in 3 countries of China from 2018 to 2020. The children in the intervention schools were given a 2-year nutrition and health education course, while the control schools did not receive any intervention. Students' nutrition knowledge, dietary intake, and dietary behaviors were collected using a questionnaire, and height and weight were measured uniformly. The nutrition knowledge score in the intervention group was increased by 1.01 and 0.64 points in the first and second years. A multi-level model was used to evaluate the intervention effects. Statistically significant interactions between groups and time were observed in nutrition knowledge. The frequency of eating breakfast and dietary intake, including meat, eggs, milk, and vegetables, but not in nutritional status. Therefore, the supplementation of school-based nutrition and health education had a positive impact on the nutrition knowledge and dietary intake of the rural Chinese children. That's important to understand and shows from a public health standpoint that the schools need to be teaching more about proper nutrition. And if the schools aren't going to do it, of course, parents and other family members need to be doing that. But in order to do that, they need to educate themselves on what proper nutrition is. So I'm going to hammer this a little bit. Whole grain intake and mortality for all causes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer, a systemic review and dose-response meta-analysis of prospective cohort studies. Now, what you need to understand is whole grains are good for you, okay? So there's a lot of vilification of whole grains. Whole grains have been a centerpiece of the U.S. diet since the Adventist health movement. Unfortunately, it became popular to eat refined grains and sweet and highly sweetened cereals, okay? But the concept of the cereal-based breakfast was popularized by John Harvey Kellogg. His brother, unfortunately, made the cereals and products more marketable, which resulted, of course, in unhealthy breakfast cereals. So, but whole grains like oatmeal and bran flakes are healthy. So no conclusive information is available, blah, 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 da, 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 da. Okay. So the pooled research for all-cause mortality, da, 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 total whole grain intake, da, 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 were also associated with this. So whole grain intake was associated with a reduced risk of mortality from cardiovascular disease. Each additional 3 servings, a total of whole grains, was associated with a 25% lower risk of mortality from cardiovascular disease. An inverse association was observed between whole grain intake and risk of mortality from total cancers. They found an inverse association between whole grain intake and mortality from all causes, cardiovascular disease, and total cancers. So high intake of whole grains has been suggested as a key component of healthy eating for longevity. Whole grains, including dark bread, whole grain breakfast cereal, popcorn, cooked oatmeal, wheat germ, brown rice, and bran, contain endosperm, germ, and bran, in contrast to refined grains, which contain only the endosperm and lose the germ and bran during the milling process. Compared with refined grains, whole grains contain higher amounts of dietary fiber, magnesium, phytochemicals, and other functional compounds. In both developed and developing countries, cardiovascular events and cancer are the main cause of mortality. Therefore, dietary factors that are inversely associated with the incidence of these chronic conditions might also be associated with reduced mortality and help people live longer. Whole grain intake has been linked inversely with the incidence of cardiovascular disease. 2 meta-analyses of cohort studies reported the inverse association of total dietary fiber intake with all-cause mortality. In addition, another recent meta-analysis of cohort studies reported that cereal fiber intake was associated with lower risk of all-cause cardiovascular disease and cancer mortality. Some, but not all, earlier investigations showed an inverse association between whole grain intake and mortality. Several studies documented that consumption of whole grain foods was associated with lower risk of mortality, including death from cardiovascular disease. However, some others reported no significant association. Findings from the meta-analysis on whole grain consumption and all-cause mortality overall, combining participants. Okay, some group. Okay, we found significant inverse associations between both total whole grain intake and specific whole grain food consumption and all-cause mortality. So the findings were among the reported, combining the estimates, subgroup analysis of exposure revealed that intake of both total whole grains and specific whole grains was inversely associated with cardiovascular disease mortality. No single study influenced the final association. Findings from the current meta-analysis supported the hypothesis that high consumption of whole grains was associated with lower risk of mortality from all causes, cardiovascular disease, and total cancers. However, no significant association was found between total whole grain intake and mortality from specific cancers. Similar to our findings, accumulating evidence from observational studies has shown significant inverse associations between whole grain intake. So what they're saying here is it does stop. It seems to lower the risk of total cancers, but not specific cancers. What that means is specific cancers would be, of course, specific cancers. So that would be, like colon cancer or things of that, stomach cancer, things of that nature, oral cancer, lung cancer, bladder cancer. So it lowers your risk of total cancers, but not any specific cancer. That wasn't found in the meta-analysis. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means in the meta-analysis they didn't find that. But the consumption of whole grains does lower your risk of cardiovascular disease and total risk of cancer. This is another meta-analysis. The meta-analysis provides further evidence that whole grain intake is associated with a reduced risk of coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, and total cancer, and mortality from all causes, respiratory diseases, infectious diseases, diabetes, and all non-cardiovascular, non-cancer causes. These findings support dietary guidelines that recommend increased intake of whole grains to reduce the risk of chronic diseases. And then you can read this on your own if you'd like. So my point is that I now follow a calorically restricted diet. I do eat more whole grains, particularly whole wheat, whole oats, and things of that, and whole corn, things of that nature. But I do follow more or less just a regular caloric restriction with optimal nutrition diet, a Cron diet, a vegan version of the Cron diet. I don't intermittently fast anymore, and I am wary to suggest intermittent fasting to anybody simply because I know that it made me feel like crap unnecessarily. So that's going to be all for this video.